So I'd like to start with a story. There's a character from the Sufis. His name is Nasruddin. Nasruddin is taken to be a wise teacher, but he does many, many foolish things. So anyway, many of the stories are humorous, and they're often told to children, it turns out. So this story, Nasruddin went to a wealthy man's house and knocked on the door, and the servant came out. And Nasruddin says, "Is your master at home? I've come collecting alms for the poor." And the servant looked a little bit anxious and said, "No, I'm sorry, my master's gone out to town." And Nasruddin said, well, even though he didn't give to the poor this time, that's all right. I'll give him this advice for free. Tell your master that the next time he goes out to town, he should take his face with him. The servant looked quizzical. "What do you mean?" Nasruddin said, "Well, when your master went out to town, he left his face in the window where anybody could steal it." Now, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to figure out what happened here. Essentially, the wealthy man saw Nasruddin coming, his face in the window, told the servant to tell him he'd gone out of town or gone to town. And what's interesting about this story is there's a picture in the book that I read it in, and that picture shows this wealthy man's face in a window and his headless body walking down the street. And what this highlights for me is this sense of how, when we are not speaking the truth, we are out of integrity. Now, what does that mean, though? What does the word integrity mean? Many of you might remember 6th grade or 7th grade math. There was something called an integer. And an integer basically is a whole number. So the word integrity is about being whole. And when we are not telling the truth, if we actually pay attention, we can sense almost a part of ourselves splitting off from ourselves, almost like there's an auric body, if you will, that is not connected and certainly not centered in our physical body. There's this sense of constantly looking to the outside to make sure nobody sees how I'm not telling the truth. And in that way, there is a sense that we're not experiencing wholeness. And so as we go through the talk tonight, I'd like to just keep this idea in mind that the intentions that we hold ultimately can be felt in the body. And when we are lined up with our highest intention, there is a sense of integrity. There's a sense of feeling whole. And when we are not aligned with our highest intentions, there's a sense of being out of alignment in the body, a sense of not being whole, not being centered. And it can be felt. We've discussed this somewhat already today, and I'd like to spend a little more time on it. So when we talk about the Buddha's great teaching of the Four Noble Truths, the fourth noble truth is what's called the Eightfold Path. There are many components to it, but I'd like to focus on the second part of the Eightfold Path, first of all, called wise intention or right intention. And the Buddha basically talks about 3 intentions that we might hold, and you've heard them already in this retreat. One of them is renunciation, which we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about because it sounds like such a dire word, but it has very, very practical meaning to it. The second is kindness, loving kindness. And the third, which we're not going to spend time on tonight just because of time, is compassion. So these are the Buddha's invitation for us to hold as an intention. And again, what is an intention, right? An intention is a guiding star. It says, this is the direction that I am training in. It's not that we're automatically there. It's not that we berate ourselves because we're not there. And it's not that there's an on-off switch for any of these, but rather we train ourselves in renunciation and kindness and compassion more and more and more, in finer and finer and finer ways, in subtler and subtler and subtler ways. And our intentions, right, ultimately relate to everything we do. The words that we take, the actions that we take, the thoughts that we have in our minds, right? As we train in these intentions, all of these start to shift and change. And the Buddha invites these as wise intentions because everything the Buddha talked about is how to move beyond dukkha, how to move beyond suffering, how to move beyond stress. And the more we can cultivate renunciation, kindness, compassion, the more we experience freedom and the less we experience suffering. So the more and more we bring our intention into each day, the more we practice trying to live to our intention, the more these intentions become the default. At first, we have to think about it. First, we have to remember it. At first, it has to be a cognitive or a logical experience. And eventually, as anything that we practice, it becomes part of who we are. So to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about here, some of you have heard this story before. I apologize, but it was a signature time for me really understanding these experiences. So for 32 years, I was a high school physics teacher, and there's a website called ratemyteacher.com. And students go on there and they say how is their teacher, what their teacher's like. And if you look at some of the earlier versions, there's things like, well, he knows what he's talking about, but he's kind of mean, or he's not fair. And then later ones are, wow, he's the greatest teacher, kind of thing. Not that there are a lot of either of those, but you kind of can see the progression. And the shift between, well, he's kind of mean, to, wow, what a great teacher, was related to mindfulness. So what would happen is I'd go into the classroom each day with an agenda. I'd worked hard on this agenda. I wanted to make sure it went through. We had a major test at the end of the year, a national test. I wanted to make sure they were ready. So I'd start to go through my agenda, and then something would happen. Maybe a student would say, Mr. Eisenstein, we can't have the test tomorrow because of, for whatever reasons, or the secretary would call into my room and she'd say, Mr. Eisenstein, can you send half your class down to an assembly that wasn't announced? And what I would start to do with all of these situations is speak harshly. I'd get an edge in my voice, or I would be sarcastic or something like that. And in fact, at one point, the secretary told me, yeah, you're one of those teachers, one of those who kind of always has this kind of edge to them. And when she told that to me, I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to be one of those teachers. So I decided it needed to change, but it wasn't easy. And the first thing I started to realize is I would pay attention to sensations in my body. As just before I was about to speak harshly, there was a kind of clenching all up and down the core of my body. And if I could tap into that, it would stop me from tumbling forward into reactivity. Or I'd catch it sooner, maybe apologize or something. Or I might name my emotions. I might say, wow, I'm feeling frustrated, because that's what the clenching was really an indicator of, was frustration. And if I could just say that I'm frustrated, it was very different than me speaking harshly to a student or a coworker in some kind of way and making them feel bad. So that was a big help, huge help, stopped the process in its tracks to some degree. But I had to always be mindful. Ultimately, I started to look at my intention, my automatic intention. My automatic intention in those days was to get through my agenda. I'd said I'd worked hard at it and I didn't want to have to do it again. So really there was a kind of clinging on to making this thing work, and I was going to bull my way through. But that was my automatic intention. When I actually asked myself, what's my highest intention? It wasn't to get through the agenda. It was that these students and coworkers felt good in my presence, that they felt good about themselves, that they found learning physics was something that they enjoyed because they were in a presence of someone who cared. And so that became my practice. How do I cultivate this kindness? So I would practice in meditation. I would sense into, what does it feel like to go through the day manifesting kindness? And it had a very different feel than going through the day and trying to make my agenda work. Different feel. I could notice it. And I cultivated that feel. And so that became the practice, that every day to go in with the intention, how can I manifest kindness? So when the bird flew in the room and screwed up my entire agenda, my sense was, how can I be kind about this? Changed everything. Changed how everyone felt about me. Huge. Okay, so that's the importance of intention and cultivating intention. So let's talk about the intentions of renunciation and then the intention of kindness. So let's talk about renunciation. What does that mean? It sounds, as I said, like a really harsh word. But for our purposes, it's very, very practical. So the Buddha's four noble truths, the first noble truth is the recognition that there is suffering, that there is dukkha, that there is stress, and that we kind of bring it into conscious awareness. If we push it under the rug, if we don't bring it into conscious awareness, it stays around. We can never move beyond it. So that's the first one. We're not going to talk about that one today. But the second noble truth was profound for me, which was that the cause of our suffering, the cause of our stress, is not what happens in the outside world, but how we relate to it, how we cling to things being a certain way. That's the cause of our stress. That's the cause of our suffering. So we can feel that, right? There's a felt sense to clinging. So I want to give you an example of that. I want you to feel what this is like. I'm going to ask everybody to imagine there's a pole sitting about a foot in front of you, third of a meter for those of you in metric units. And I'm going to ask you to put your hands out as if you're grabbing the pole. And I would like you to just hold onto that pole, really grab it tightly. And as you do, notice how it feels in the body. Notice the sensations of muscular contraction in the arms and the chest and the belly. There's a certain contraction in the mind. The mind kind of gets narrow as you try to cling on to this thing. There's almost I'm trying to make something happen. Get a sense of that. Getting a sense of that. Okay, now you can let go. And now I'll ask you to imagine that there is something in your life that is so important and you've got to make it happen. Maybe, there's somebody in your life who really bothers you and you really want them to be different. Or there's some, job that you really want to get. Or maybe you want to get praise for the work that you do and you really feel like this is so important. It could, or you need your kids to be a certain way. You want your kids to be, going to sleep on time and doing their homework, right? Find something and just sense what it's like when you really cling on to that mentally. And begin to notice, what does it feel like? You might have some of the same sensations. They'll be more subtle for sure than actually clinging onto a pole, but they're there. There's a sense of tightening of the chest and maybe some muscular contraction in the arms. Maybe the hands get a little tight or the belly gets a little tight or the mind gets narrow. You can feel the mind. It's interesting. We don't think about feeling the mind, but we can feel the mind, almost like the muscles of the head start to come together a little bit. That's clinging. And now the invitation is to see if you can let go of that. What's it like to not cling so tightly? To let things be a little bit more okay. To not get so caught up in things being just so. Notice the release to whatever degree that can happen. Don't expect it's going to be complete, right? But to whatever degree that can happen, there's a kind of releasing, a kind of letting go that can happen. There's an ease, there's less stress, less dukkha. So that's a practice, right? Learning to let go of clinging to things being just so. And with that, finding greater and greater freedom. So what are some of the things we cling to? Well, as I've said already, we can cling to things in the outside world being a certain way, right? We can cling to our kids or our spouses or our friends or our parents or our political figures or whoever being a certain way. We can cling on really tightly to that, which is challenging because they don't do what we want them to do. They do their own thing. We might have some influence, but trying to change everything, it's a lot of work. Or we might be clinging to certain states of being, right? We might be clinging to security. And we might be in a state where things aren't so secure right now. Can we be okay? Or we might be clinging to comfort. And when that comfort and we find ourselves uncomfortable, can we be okay? Can we not cling to comfort? Can discomfort be a state of being that we can be with? Or we might be clinging to status, right? Or other people viewing us as, I don't know, something, right? All these are states of being that we might be clinging to. Or we might be clinging to views. This was a big one for the Buddha, right? Everybody has their opinion about the nature of the world. And then we cling to it and we say, oh, this is the way it is. I know. And if you're going to counter that, forget it. That's terrible. There's a cartoon, I can't remember who it's by. It shows some, I don't know, aliens. I guess you'd call them aliens. They're like Martian type beings. There's an adult one and some little kid ones. And they're in a museum and there's a glass case. And in that glass case, there's like a human living room and, two chairs with a dumpy looking man and woman sitting in it. And the older Martian is saying, these are humans. Normally they're pretty harmless, but if you touch their food or argue against their opinions, they can get vicious. So our views are one of the things we cling to. It's important to have views. The Buddhists certainly had views, but it's one thing to have a view. It's another to say, this is truth. This is truth. The truth with a capital T. And very significantly, we cling on to a sense of who we are. We might cling on to a view that I am a kind person, and then I might find myself not being kind and then shame myself for it. Or I am a smart person, and then I find situations where I'm not very capable. And suddenly, do I turn on myself or turn on others, right? Or I'm a good parent and my children don't seem to live up to my ideal about how they're supposed to be, and suddenly there's a turning on myself or a turning on them. These are all things that we can cling to. And the practice is to learn to ultimately, slowly let go. What don't we need to hold on to quite so tightly? This is renunciation. This sense that I can soften the clinging. I don't have to cling so tightly onto what I'm believing, my view of myself, things being a certain way. I feel the ease, and that becomes an aspiration. That becomes an intention to find ways to not cling so tightly. I was clinging to an agenda happening. And I had to learn how to let go of clinging to that. When I did, so much more happy. Absolutely. So much more freedom. Not that I didn't have an agenda, I did every day, but I didn't cling to it. That was what was different. So when we're letting go of clinging, there are degrees to this. So on one side, there is ultimately holding on. I am trying to make things be a certain way. Absolutely. On the other side, I've entirely let go. No clinging at all. Here, no freedom. Here, lots of freedom. But there's a caveat, which is we're clinging because we're scared. We're scared of something. We're not yet ready to fully let go. If we let go too much too fast, we get really scared and then go right back. We cling again. So there's a sweet spot. There's a place right at somewhere in between. Sometimes it's close to the clinging on entirely. Sometimes it's closer to letting go entirely, but it could be anywhere. The sweet spot is we let go as much as we can up to a point where we start to feel a little anxious. Not so much that we can't handle it, but a little anxious. And then we rest in that spot. There we revel in how much freedom we are able to experience, and we breathe with the sensations of anxiety. We just let them be there, and we get used to this place. And we start to sense into, okay, how do I move through my world with this degree of renunciation? What do I have to let be okay? What do I have to let be okay for me to have this degree of freedom? Okay, so let's do a little practice with this. I ask you to go ahead and close your eyes for a moment, unless you're one of those people who is going through this meditation practice with their eyes open, then you can keep your eyes open. And I'll invite you to bring to mind something that you have a tendency to cling to. Again, maybe it's things being a certain way in your world. Maybe it's a state of being. Maybe it's a view, an opinion, or a view of yourself. Find something that you have a tendency to cling to. It doesn't have to be something you cling to the most, but there's kind of that automatic clinging muscle that happens, right? Do you notice? And when you've got something to work with, I'll invite you to just simply notice what happens in your mind and body and behavior when you really cling tight. You can exaggerate this for a moment. Really cling tight. And then sensing, experimenting with how much can you let go of the grip and still feel reasonably safe. A little anxious, right? But not too bad, not too much. See if you can, how much can the system, the mind-body system just kind of release, let go. You'll notice there's a little anxiety. Can I really do this? But you can. You just kind of breathe through the sensations of that. See if you can begin to appreciate the level of freedom that's here. And now, as you continue to try to maintain this degree of letting go, I'm going to ask you to imagine going through your day. There'll be all kinds of things that might try to trigger you to cling again. So you have to kind of get a sense of, what can I let be okay? What can I let just be and not get so uptight about it? What would I have to tolerate? Just kind of imagine going through pieces of your day, moments when, you might be triggered to cling again, but don't. One of the things I'm going to invite you to do once you leave here tonight, and you're out in your world, see if you can practice this. See if you can practice the feel of not clinging so much. Noticing when there are discomforts or things that challenge your views or things that challenge your sense of who you are, and realize that if I cling again, it's going to be more dukkha. See if I can just hang out. There's a couple of cartoons by my favorite cartoonist, Bradford Veely. One of them shows a woman talking on the phone while sitting on the couch, and she's got a huge starfish clinging onto her. Her arms around the starfish, and the starfish is clinging onto her. And she's on the phone, and she says, "Walter? Well, he's romantic, witty, very charming, and yes, a little on the clingy side. But that's okay. I'm sure I can change him." Another one shows a gravestone. It says, Fred N. Perkins, July 22nd, 1929 to November 3rd, 2002. Still waiting for apologies from the following people. How much do we cling? Okay, so let's talk about kindness, right? The intention of kindness. Kindness also has a feel to it, right? So let's do another little practice. I'm going to ask you again to close your eyes or not close your eyes, depending. And I'd like you to bring up some time when someone was kind to you. Someone offered you a kindness. Could be something as little as your pet nuzzling against you, but somehow someone offered you a kindness. And notice the feel in your body as you receive that kindness. Savor that for a moment. And then I'll invite you to bring up a time where you were kind to someone else and they appreciated it. And once again, savoring that feeling, noticing the feeling. These feelings might be the same, or they might be different in some way. Someone kind to you, you being kind to someone, them appreciating it. But notice the sensations of well-being. So this is an aspiration. The Buddha invites us to have this as an intention because it feels good. It just feels good. So as Stig offered today in our loving kindness meditation practice, we cultivate a sense of kindness, and it's intention, it's a training, right? We do it a little at a time, but we cultivate it for more and more beings. We start with someone who's easy to care for. We bring it to ourselves, right? For many of us, that's the hardest person to care for, but nevertheless, that's important, super, super important. And we bring it to our loved ones and people we don't even know. Then people who push our buttons, right? And ultimately to all beings. We can even bring kindness to our activities. Like we can bring kindness to taking out the garbage, for instance. Yeah. Or we can bring kindness to mosquitoes. I'm still working on that one, but ultimately, kindness is infectious. Absolutely infectious. Kindness brings about well-being within ourselves, and that then spills out to everyone else. We all have what are called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are neurons in the brain that transmit the emotion of another. If someone were to enter your space and they were all kind of agitated, you'd start feeling agitated, right? You'd start to feel it. You might even say, why are you making me so angry? But here's the secret of mirror neurons. It's gold to whatever degree you can get this. If somebody comes into your vicinity and they're agitated or they're fearful or whatever, and you start to feel it, because you'll know they're experiencing it, and you realize, and this isn't mine. Can I calm this down? Can I come to a place of peace or equanimity or well-being or love or kindness? And you know what happens? Their mirror neurons start to fire and they start to calm down. Thich Nhat Hanh says, if you have a group of people in a boat and you're in a storm and everything's rocking, if one person can get really, really calm, calms everybody else down. That's the mirror neurons acting. So kindness is so powerful. It relieves suffering. It relieves fear. And it's a training. It's a training. We work on it a little at a time, but the more and more we can cultivate it, first mentally and then kind of living it, the more it changes our world and it changes ourselves. Less dukkha. So there's a story about this, right? There's a story, the Metta Sutta. This is the teaching where the Buddha actually taught his monks to offer metta, to offer loving kindness, basically everywhere, right? To all beings. It's almost like you're an antenna for loving kindness and sending it everywhere. Basically, the reason this came about was he had sent these monks during the rainy season to a particular forest and to do their meditations. And at first, the tree spirits and the ghosts that were there, oh, they're these nice monks. It'll be nice for them to be here. But they thought they were only going to stay a day or two. Turns out the monks were there for the whole rainy season, which was months. And pretty soon, these ghosts and tree spirits, if you got visitors for more than a few days, they start to smell, right? So they started to get pretty upset that these monks were going to be here for a long time. So they conspired to scare the monks, and they made all these noises and bad smells and, all kinds of apparitions. And the monks, scared out of their minds, couldn't meditate. So they hightailed it back to the Buddha, and they said, we can't be there. So the Buddha thought, and he said, no, that's the place you're supposed to be, but here's what you got to do. And he taught them the Metta Sutta. He taught them to exude loving kindness in all directions. And so that's what the monks did. They went back, they exuded loving kindness. And the result was that the ghosts and the tree spirits, they felt great being in this presence of loving kindness. And they all got along for the whole rainy season after that. So loving kindness creates an environment around us of well-being, creates an environment within us of well-being, and it helps to lessen our experience of fear. Now, there's an assumption here, right? If I'm going to offer loving kindness to all beings, I have to assume that all beings are doing the best they can with what they have available to them at any time. If I'm in judgment of them that they're bad or they're wrong in some way, I can't hold them in loving kindness. Just not possible. I have to, at some level, recognize that, there's a phrase from Longfellow. He says that if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each person's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. We don't know what has caused another being to be the way they are, to see themselves in the world the way they do. Ultimately, each of us, every one of us, ourselves included, are doing the best we can with what we have available to us. And even further, every one of us is a manifestation of the divine, just as we are. That one's a hard one to swallow. But if you think about it for a moment, at least logically, how do we all get here, right? We all got here from a whole lot of causes and conditions, none of which we created for ourselves, right? We didn't create this earth. We didn't create evolution. We didn't create the specific genes that went into this body, right? We didn't create all the experiences we had. They happened to us. We didn't create the messages that we got. So what is happening is everything that we are, if we think of all manifestation as divine in some way, however you want to define that, right? It's a mystery, right? Manifestation of the mystery. We're a creation of it, just like everything else, just as we are. In a sense, there's a perfection, just as we are. There's a sense of perfection in our being. Not that we're not growing and changing, we are. That's also happening. Not that we can't be better. It's a kind of paradox. But there's a sense of manifestly already perfect and divine as we are, and at the same time becoming. When we can begin to hold everyone from that assumption, then we can hold them in loving kindness. At a relative level, we might have to work against what they do, right? We might have to protest, we might have to, argue, we might have to take actions they don't like. All kinds of things might have to happen, but we can still hold them in kindness as doing the best they can with what they've got available to us. We can start with ourselves, really start with ourselves, right? Total epidemic of experiencing an inner critic, right? So many of us experience this inner critic, and it causes a lot of challenge, right? So we can hold the intention of holding ourselves in kindness, because this inner critic just keeps coming up and we keep feeling dukkha, we keep feeling suffering, right? Every time it raises its head. How do we begin to work with that inner critic? How do we begin to cultivate kindness for ourselves? So one of the entryways is mindfulness. Rather than let that critical voice stay in the background, we actually learn to bring it into conscious awareness. We actually start to notice it. We hear the words of it, not to believe it. Not to believe it. We'll talk about that in a moment. But if we never see it, we can never begin to move beyond it. So, first of all, when we bring it into awareness, we have some component of witness around the critical voice. That witness is not experiencing the critical voice. That witness is not affected by it. So there's some part of us that has some space with it, right? We also can notice the effect, right? How does this critical voice affect us? There was one therapy session that I had where, I was experiencing the inner critic, and this therapist asked me to have it take the form of an image. And it took the form of an arm that was coming from around my back, and there was a hand, and the hand had a little dagger in it, and it was stabbing me in the solar plexus. That was it. That's what it was doing. I could feel that. It's like, ow, that hurts. But as soon as I noticed what it was doing, because he asked me to notice it, it realized, oh, you see me. I have to stop now, right? Very often, the inner critic gains its strength because it's not seen. Not really. But as soon as we actually see it, it loses some of its power. Part of that is we can notice the effect. Just like we can notice the effect of grasping, we can notice the effect of when we're not kind, right? It has an effect on the body. We can feel it. And once we start to feel it, we realize, wow, why would I want to do that to myself? That doesn't make any sense. So that gives us some impetus to start to move beyond it. The other thing we can notice about that inner critic is that most of the time what it says is kind of ridiculous. It talks in these big, broad statements. You are a fraud. You are unlovable. You are, it's like Oz, right? The Wizard of Oz talking until we see behind the curtain. Because usually, where did that voice come from? I rarely talk about Freud, but this time it really makes sense, because Freud talked about something called the superego. And that superego is essentially that inner critic. It's that judge that says, do this, don't do this, you're no good, all of that. And he says it starts to develop in us pretty uniformly around age 5. Around age 5. Now, how wise do you think this voice is if it starts around age 5? You see, my sense about what's going on with this inner critic is that when we're very young, our emotional selves are very vulnerable. If someone, if somebody criticizes you and you're really young, it feels like it's the worst thing in the world, and then nobody's going to love you, whatever, all sorts of things. Lots of what's called highly labile emotions. when we're young because we don't have the protections that we eventually gain as we grow older. I mean, you don't have that same kind of emotional state that you do when you were really young. So that critic is like a 5-year-old's voice that says, don't do that, you're going to get hurt, right? If your voice is saying, you're a fraud, what's it really saying? It's saying, don't go out there in the world and show yourself because people might realize you don't know everything and then they'll criticize you and you'll be hurt. That's what it's really saying. See how big that is? It's trying to protect a 5-year-old sensibility. When in reality, none of us knows everything. We can't ever know everything. All we can do is do some learning, start working with whatever we're working with, and learn along the way and keep growing. That's how it works. And some people won't like it and some people will get upset, and that's also how it works. But it doesn't mean I'm a fraud. It just means I'm growing and I'm a human being. So we can begin to find the cracks in these beliefs, in the voice that the inner critic is offering. Sometimes our rational mind realizes, I know I'm lovable. It's just that there's this old belief that kind of is hanging out subconsciously that says I'm not, right? Sometimes we realize that. Sometimes, we feel like, oh my God, this is really the truth. Because, we have what's called a confirmation bias. If we already believe something from very young, then we look out into the world and only see that which confirms what we already believe. And we miss everything that doesn't. And it's going to take some practice and effort and meditation to really start to find those cracks. But one thing that can be really helpful, and again, I've said this before, I think in this retreat, is that many of these deep-seated beliefs that we're not worthy or we're not safe in some way were downloaded into us like programming. It's just a download. When we were really young, before we had any virus protection, by people who didn't know any better. They may have acted like they knew better, but they didn't. They were fumbling around just like the rest of us, which makes what these beliefs familiar, but it doesn't make them true. It makes them familiar, but it doesn't make them true. So, one of the ways that we can work with this inner critic is to bring it to consciousness, to notice what it's saying or doing. Sometimes in imagery, we try to find some distance from it so we can see it better, or put up a barrier, an imaginal barrier, so that its words can't really hurt us. But ultimately, we want to see this critic as like a 5-year-old trying to protect a 5-year-old. And we can begin to hold it in kindness and care. And as we can start to do that, the critic starts to change and shift. It doesn't have the same hold on us that it did before. When we're judging others, a little side note, but an important one. When we find ourselves judging others, usually what I've discovered is it's a two-way street. I'm judging others because I'm also judging myself. I'm trying to live up to some outside standard, and others aren't living up to it, so I'm going to judge them. But if I don't live up to that standard, I judge myself. So use that also if you're noticing judging of others as something that's habitual for you. You might want to turn it around for a little bit and be curious, am I judging myself? Similar kind of way, it's that inner critic that's happening again. Okay. All right, so we're going to do another little practice. Going to invite you to close your eyes or leave them open again. And I'm going to invite you to recreate the experience of kindness. Somebody offering you a kindness, or you offering a kindness. See if you can generate the feel of kindness in your body. Don't worry that there are people it's hard to be kind to. It's totally okay. You don't have to be perfect with this. It's an intention. It's an aspiration. It's not an on-off switch. It's a direction. And see if you can hold that sense of kindness within your body. And now imagine going into your day with the intention of transmuting anything that occurs into kindness. You might even imagine that you can create a kindness bubble around you, or a kindness field. To whatever degree you can feel kindness in your body, imagine that it overflows your body into the space around you. And that field of kindness kind of keeps nurturing you, but also it moves with you. Wherever you go, you take it with you. And when you encounter others, either in person or virtually, they get to enter that kindness field. And they get touched by it. Mirror neurons in action. So you might imagine different things, some things simpler, maybe loved ones that you come in contact with. How do you bring kindness to them? Even if they're grumpy or not doing what you want them to do. I have a cat. It's peeing where it shouldn't be peeing. And still hold her in love. Still hold her in kindness. And imagining co-workers you're interacting with, and some of them are doing what you want to be doing, and some of them screw up. They don't do the job in the way that you think they're supposed to be doing the job. Can you still hold them in kindness? Even so. You get to practice reading the news or watching the news and holding beings with kindness, even the ones you don't like or you disagree with. As you go through your day with kindness and with renunciation, letting go of clinging, it opens up the possibility of courage. It opens up the possibility of saying what is true. Though said in a way that's kind. It opens up the capacity for us to feel a sense of integrity, a sense of wholeness. That is a powerful, powerful feeling to experience. And again, we practice, it occurs over time. We keep coming back. But if we ever get some sense of that integrity, that wholeness, the power of that, we want to come back again and again. It becomes easier and easier for us to find that way again and again. So I'll end with a poem by Hafiz. It's one of my favorite poems. He says, admit something. Everyone you see, you say to them, love me. Of course, you don't do this out loud, otherwise someone would call the cops. Still, though, think about this. This great pull in each of us to connect. Why not become the one who lives with a full moon in each eye, that is always saying with that sweet moon language what every other eye in the world is dying to hear?